Welcome to Team 7's presentation for HM668, the role of tort reform in private insurance markets. Healthcare costs have risen dramatically in recent decades. Fear of being sued has resulted in an increase in the practice of defensive medicine, contributing to the rising cost of healthcare. Insurance premiums have sharply increased, due at least in part to the large awards and costs of litigation, as well as skyrocketing medical costs. Tort reform has become a focused attempt to stabilize healthcare costs while reducing the perceived need to practice defensive medicine. This presentation will discuss the impact of tort reform on insurance in the private markets, examining whether tort reform leads to improvements in medical malpractice insurance market conditions, or conversely, if it actually precipitates an adverse market environment. In this examination, we will consider the history of tort law through the centuries, tort law in the 21st century, conventional and proposed tort reform, impact on liability insurance, as well as the future of tort reform and recommendations for action. Tort and tort reform are contentious topics. Tort reform seldom receives approval from all stakeholders and tends to give rise to much division, awakening the respective political lobbies, and all lean in to add their voice to the melee. The direction of tort reform is largely contingent upon the strength of the competing interests of each party. Laws are passed and changes are made, but rarely does it seem that the patient is fairly represented. This presentation reveals that much regarding tort is still unresolved in the US, and the inconsistencies, the costs, and the division between the stakeholders continue to nourish and nurture this cyclic disorder of tort reform. Tort law is described by Black's Law Dictionary as one of three options: a direct invasion of some legal right of the individual, an infraction of some public duty by which special damage accrues to the individual, or the violation of some private obligation by which like damage accrues to the individual. Tort law in healthcare is commonly regarded as medical malpractice. This area typically remedies wrongful death, injury and disability, negligence, battery, and false imprisonment. Tort law has been in existence through the centuries, almost since the beginning of humankind. The Code of Hammurabi in 1700 BC was predicated on ancient Sumerian laws, which included many elements of tort law, such as intentional tort, negligence, strict liability, objective standards for conduct, monetary compensation for private harms, and contributory negligence. Tort law is also found throughout Mosaic law and in Roman and Greek civilizations. Plato himself outlined the judicial process. He proposed enactments on an assault and battery, taking into consideration types of wounds inflicted, by whom and on whom, as well as where, how, and when they occurred. He acknowledged the complexity of tort law and the problems with the prescription of sanctions. Roman, Germanic, Islamic, and even canon law all influenced the development of what we know today as tort law. The roots of what we know today as tort law took on new meaning in the 19th century when Oliver Wendell Holmes examined the history of negligence in search of a general theory of tort. He concluded that from England's earliest times, the basis of tort liability was fault, or the failure to exercise due care. This later became known as the standard of care, which is the basis for judicial decisions in tort law today. Following World War II, tort law came into its own. Advocates for tort reform had many opinions. Some advocated that the role of negligence be drastically reduced in personal injury tort law, while many others opposed such a move. It was here that tort law enjoyed a true revival. It was also when liability insurance began to emerge as a key factor in the debate. A rapid rise in medical malpractice claims occurred during the 1970s and 80s. There was also a climb in the amount awarded per medical malpractice claim. This in turn spawned a twofold response. Greater malpractice premiums forced a reduction in the number of private insurance companies for this market, which in turn resulted in a departure of physicians from both specialties and general medical practice. This cascade of events sparked the call for policy change both at state and federal levels, resulting in modern tort reform. Tort reform refers collectively to a variety of administrative and legislative changes in the civil justice system that place limits on the type or amount of damages that may be awarded in personal injury lawsuits. But what exactly is tort reform? Numerous mainstream tort reforms were enacted in recent decades. The most commonly implemented reforms address many of the aspects of tort law that we have learned about in this class, namely joint and several liability, collateral source payments, non-economic and punitive damages, statute of limitations, and attorney contingency fees. Even before the passing of the Affordable Care Act into US law in 2010, the malpractice insurance crisis prompted healthcare providers, medical organizations, insurers, and others associated with medical care to push for more reforms. These groups continue today to call for reforms that could mitigate the rising costs of healthcare. In addition to these stakeholder groups are those who oppose medical malpractice reform, a group largely consisting of those who litigate cases and seek compensation for the most central interested party, the patient. One of the principal stakeholder groups is the physicians, who collectively are faced with potential lawsuits and litigations every day. If realized, these suits can be extremely costly for insurance companies, as well as for the physicians and the organizations in which they practice. Consequently, doctors and providers are, by and large, great proponents of reform, believing it to be a means to contain expenses, reduce lawsuits, and ease the psychological burden of malpractice litigation. So, proponents of medical malpractice reform assert that effects on physicians have precipitated a rise in what is known as defensive medicine. Defensive medicine describes a pervasive practice adopted by litigation-weary physicians who order diagnostic tests or screenings, not so much to diagnose and treat a patient, but instead to prevent missing something which could give rise to a lawsuit. Tort scholars think of this practice more as over-deterrence, meaning that current tort laws lead physicians to take more precautions than are socially optimal. However, studies suggest that many popular tort reforms are only modestly associated with the level of physicians' malpractice concern and their practice of defensive medicine. The differences in physicians' concerns across states with and without tort reforms were also very minimal. Overall, with respect to malpractice, physicians actually seem largely insensitive to reforms, including caps on non-economic and punitive damages. Reforms such as collateral source rule reform and periodic payment reform have not been shown to be statistically relevant. It is worth mentioning, however, that two types of reform did show significantly higher levels of concern for physicians, and these were split recovery and patient compensation funds. Medical professional organizations have been pushing for liability limiting tort reforms for years, but this evidently has not brought practitioners comfort or assuaged fears of malpractice litigation. On the whole, physicians' concerns regarding malpractice are largely unchanged by the idea of tort reform. This means that the practice of defensive medicine will continue to be a chief player in the delivery of patient care. Insurance companies are essentially supporters of tort reform, though not always in concert with their provider so-called allies. Physicians still pay hefty medical liability insurance premiums in order to stay in business, as well as to provide those injured as a result of a tortious act the opportunity to sue for damages. The medical lobby in the past predicted that tort reform would reduce the cost of malpractice insurance. The reality, however, is that rates remain consistent. Insurance companies are not passing along their savings to the consumer, with annual profits reportedly rising from $38.7 billion in 2004 to $61.9 billion in 2007. Half the states in the US have passed some sort of malpractice cap to prevent a malpractice plaintiff from receiving excessive settlements. Placing caps on awards permits insurers to better predict losses and to stabilize the limit settings from case to case. Supporters of such initiatives claim that capping damages helps lower medical costs for the general population. Studies also reveal some relationship to insurance premiums, so it could be said that if caps and other measures are meant simply to contain malpractice insurance premiums, they seem to work, at least to some degree. Critics claim that many of the problems associated with insurance costs are the result of voracious business practices of insurance companies. A pivotal factor in the argument in favor of tort reform is the enormous cost of US healthcare, the most expensive of all developed countries. In 2012, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development ranked the US most costly of all 34 member countries, spending $8,233 per capita. The second most expensive health care per capita was Norway at $5,388. Insurance costs, as previously mentioned, are undoubtedly a contributing factor to the cost of healthcare in the US. However, with medical malpractice insurance premiums only accounting for less than 2% of total estimated national health spending, some say that tort reform would actually do little to help control rising healthcare costs. While the cost of insurance premiums are almost negligible compared with other national healthcare costs, the costs of defensive medicine and physician efforts to avoid malpractice litigation can add billions of dollars to expenditures. The data from studies conducted on the relationship between healthcare costs and tort reforms present varied results. Several studies cited lower healthcare costs in states that have enacted direct reforms, such as limits on non-economic damages, when compared to states that do not have similar reforms. Other studies have found weak relationships or no relationship at all between either medical malpractice premiums and healthcare costs or direct reforms and healthcare costs. An analysis conducted by J. William Thomas in 2010 suggests that research claiming high levels of expected savings due to tort reform is overstated, and that the savings in reality will be minimal. This may be because tort reform doesn't provide the environmental change for physicians to deter the practice of defensive medicine, and thus will not mitigate or substantially lessen the costs associated with the practice. In an editorial published in the Journal of General Internal Medicine, Studdert and friends agreed with Thomas in many respects, asserting that although such conventional tort reforms as caps on non-economic damages seek to limit malpractice litigation costs for providers, they still don't change the physician environment. The authors simply view these conventional reforms as a way to combat rising costs, as treating the symptoms but not the disease. On the other hand, during the same time frame, there were no reductions in the price of premiums for fully insured health plans. The study largely examined data from health maintenance organizations. These plans were actually unresponsive to tort reform. While the HMOs did not reflect a reduction in premiums due to reforms, the study concluded that in the aggregate, health and health insurance costs will decrease due to reform. Opponents of medical malpractice reform, mostly the legal community, refute that rising healthcare costs have any link to medical malpractice lawsuits. Instead, they blame surging insurance premiums for the hikes in cost. In addition, they declare an increase in medical error to be a major contributing factor and support their multi-million-dollar malpractice cases with the argument that they represent the most serious medical errors and the most serious injuries. With this, the legal lobby disputes such initiatives as contingency fee reduction and damage caps, claiming that caps negatively affect victims and families and target vulnerable groups while failing to deter healthcare providers from providing substandard care. This brings us to our patients, the stakeholder at the very center of this maelstrom. The patient represents by far the largest group that has skin in the game. Unfortunately, the patient also has the least sway in the matter. Tort reform is something from which patients don't directly benefit, so it's hardly surprising that it lacks educated support from the public. In summary, while injured patients see little favorable outcome from tort reform and lack a real voice in the discussion, physicians are afforded the opportunity to benefit from the protection and limits it provides and have a powerful national lobby. The largest benefactor remains the insurance providers who, as stated, profit immensely from tort reform. It can be deduced then that tort reform, in order to have any effect, must impact not only medical malpractice, but also medical practice itself. Although the perception is that malpractice costs are high, the sum totality of premiums, damages, and litigation costs constitute a small fraction of total healthcare costs. At the same time, malpractice insurance rates have continued to creep upwards. At least once a decade, over the past 3 decades, malpractice rates have increased, sometimes by as much as 100%, and theories abound as to the reasons why. According to Christopher Bernard of Koskov and Beda, medical malpractice insurers have the highest profit margins amongst all insurers. Additionally, physicians have become so conditioned to the practice of defensive medicine that they are often unaware that the roots of the many tests that they order originate out of liability concerns. All of this adds to the cost of medical malpractice insurance. While tort reform is often associated with positive market conditions, it can also lead to the opposite through the impact of higher healthcare demand. Patient avoidance was demonstrated in a study by Dubai and colleagues when they looked at the effects of tort reform on prenatal care. They evaluated the effect of malpractice liability pressure, as measured by malpractice premiums, on prenatal care utilization and infant health. Their conclusion was that concerns about malpractice actually resulted in prenatal care beginning later in pregnancy. This study contains implications for adverse market conditions predicated on malpractice liability pressures. In another study about malpractice risk, it was noted that although avoidance behaviors have troubling implications for patient access to care, policymakers tend to be more concerned about assurance behaviors because they contribute to escalating national healthcare costs. Adverse market conditions can also result from the impact of perceived liability risks on cost reduction and the risk of liability litigation. In Kashalia and Mello's New Directions in Medical Liability Reform, liability risks and costs are cited as drivers of higher healthcare spending, poorer access to care, and lower quality of care. They also declare that the tort system merely compensates the minority of those injured through negligence while producing unacceptable overhead costs. Another possible adverse impact on the medical malpractice insurance market is when insurers have the market power. Abraham and colleagues tested this hypothesis and determined that post-reform premium reductions were steeper in competitive insurance markets when measured by the number of insurance carriers. The question of whether tort reforms lead to improvements in medical malpractice insurance market conditions or to adverse market conditions is not a black and white question. Rather, it is one in which information is incomplete and where variables such as specialties, geographic region, and the many forms of managed care need to be further studied, perhaps retrospectively, to begin to formulate some of the answers. The reformation of the Affordable Care Act may also have an impact on tort reform. So, with many competing interests, questions can arise regarding the best way to proceed. And who benefits from tort reform? Here we outline some alternatives to malpractice tort reform. The first is guidelines-based systems. Under this system, providers and organizations who comply with established care standards would be presumed to be non-negligent. This safe harbor system is thought to provide incentives for physicians to adhere to best practices. It might also lessen the practice of defensive medicine and the unnecessary costs that accompany that. Opponents to the approach argue that it only promotes cookbook medicine and that it dismisses the uniqueness of the patient. Some states have dabbled a little with this approach in the past, but it is not widely utilized and would likely benefit from further research and testing. Administrative compensation systems come in two forms: health courts and no-fault systems. The health courts or medical courts model utilizes specially trained judges as the arbitrators of law rather than the generalist judge and jury setup of the current system. The no-fault model relies on an administrative body in place of the court. Both models seek to compensate a wider group of patients, albeit less generously, without regard for provider negligence. Adoption of either model would require legislative action and could be in conflict with some states' constitutional protections of rights of access to courts and jury trial. Advantages of such models include their potential to compensate injured patients more directly, consistently, and accurately, and to contain transaction costs. Criticisms of these approaches are twofold. One, the argument that broadening the base of compensable injuries could lead to much higher spending, even with the savings on administrative costs. And two, that no fault in particular may promote careless healthcare delivery and that injury might proliferate under such a system. In conclusion, while tort reform has been shown to have great potential to impact the malpractice insurance market, it hasn't been really given a fair shake at this point in time. The future of tort reform is uncertain at best and undoubtedly will always be a hot topic. But while there are strong competing interests on either side of the argument and in state capitals all over the nation, the tug of war will continue, with the ultimate loser being the injured. We recommend that our current lawmakers squarely weigh up the arguments on each side and promote legislation that meets the objectives of malpractice litigation the way our ancestors intended it. We thank you for your attention and we wish you all the best in your studies. Thanks again for your time. The next 4 pages contain our reference list. I hope you enjoyed our presentation.